Caroline, on the president's threat yesterday on social media to increase tariffs against China by an additional 50% in response to their retaliation, has he signed anything in terms of an executive order, any documentation around that? Will that additional 50% go into effect tomorrow?
They will be going into effect at 12:01 a.m. tonight, so effectively tomorrow, yes.
Work on that today?
Of course, as always.
Trump's press secretary, Carolyn Leavitt, gave off unsettling North Korea-like vibes during what was likely her most bizarre White House press briefing to date. She discussed Donald Trump's disastrous tariff policy, confirming that the United States would impose a 104% tariff on China, the world's second-largest economy, dramatically escalating an already unnecessary and potentially damaging trade war. But before we dive into that, if you enjoy this video and want to support the channel, please make sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert buttons before you leave. Now let's get into it. With two back-to-back clips of Carolyn Leavitt confirming that the trade war with China is indeed intensifying.
Caroline, on the president's threat yesterday on social media to increase tariffs against China by an additional 50% in response to their retaliation, has he signed anything in terms of an executive order, any documentation around that? Will that additional 50% go into effect tomorrow?
They will be going into effect at 12:01 a.m. tonight, so effectively tomorrow, yes.
Work on that today?
Of course, as always.
Yep, that's definitely not good. Another reporter asked her a similar question, and she doubled down on her stance.
Ed, go ahead. As promised.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned the 70 countries or so. I'm curious, though, under what conditions at this point would President Trump talk to President Xi about tariffs?
Look, I just spoke to the president about this, and he believes that China wants to make a deal with the United States. He believes China has to make a deal with the United States. It was a mistake for China to retaliate. The president, when America is punched, he punches back harder. That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect on China tonight at midnight. But the president believes that Xi and China want to make a deal. They just don't know how to get that started. And the president also wanted me to tell all of you that if China reaches out to make a deal, he'll be incredibly gracious, but he's going to do what's best for the American people.
So China has to call.
So, to recap, the entire strategy was based on Trump imposing a 34% tariff on China. And let's be clear, China is certainly a problematic trade partner, especially when it comes to the theft of American intellectual property. There's no issue with a Republican or Democratic government trying to impose sanctions or consequences on China. But a blanket 34% tariff on all goods from the world's second-largest economy is extreme. In response, China retaliated with its own 35% tariffs on all American goods. This move was what led Trump to take further action. He warned that if China didn't remove the 35% retaliatory tariffs, the U.S. would impose 104% tariffs in return. China didn't flinch. They didn't back down when they first imposed their tariffs, and they didn't budge when Trump set a deadline. So, is it possible Xi Jinping will back down? Maybe, but he hasn't yet. I'm not sure where the confidence comes from. And now, here comes more chaotic moments from this White House press briefing.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much. Kara from Lindell TV. So President Trump has designated Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization and deported its members while also moving to restrict Venezuela's oil exports. Is the administration preparing additional military or economic actions against Venezuela and the Maduro regime? And my second question is about Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Is the administration have a comment on her decision to go with the liberals and go actually with the Tren de Araguas? This is the same justice that actually sided against January 6 hostages last year. So is the administration have a comment? Are they disappointed in Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett?
To your first question, I don't have any actions to read out in terms of Venezuela. The president has imposed secondary tariffs on the Maduro regime and on Venezuela in the form of oil, which is obviously going to have a crippling effect on the Maduro regime, and that's the intended effect of this administration. As for the justice you mentioned, as for the Supreme Court, we've made our feelings very clear. We believe this.
In some ways, it seemed like that question caught Carolyn Leavitt off guard, almost like she wasn't ready for it. Kind of strange. But this is the type of person they're inviting into the White House to ask these overly flattering, almost cult-like questions. President Biden's White House never entertained this kind of thing with MSNBC, or with figures like David Pakman, Luke Beasley, Adam Mockler, or Midas Touch. They didn't bring in more liberal or progressive podcasters to ask easy, soft questions. But the Trump administration is allowing it, and the people they're attracting are truly unhinged. Here's another clip to illustrate.
To your first question, I don't have any actions to read out in terms of Venezuela. The president has imposed secondary tariffs on the Maduro regime and on Venezuela in the form of oil, which is obviously going to have a crippling effect on the Maduro regime, and that's the intended effect of this administration. As for the justice you mentioned, as for the Supreme Court, we've made our feelings very clear. We believe this.
In some ways, it seemed like that question was even more outlandish than Carolyn Levitt was prepared for. Almost as if she found it odd. But this is the kind of person they're bringing into the White House to ask these overly complimentary, almost cult-like questions. President Biden's White House never allowed this with MSNBC, or figures like David Pakman, Luke Beasley, Adam Mockler, or Midas Touch. They didn't bring in more liberal or progressive podcasters to ask softball questions. But the Trump administration is doing exactly that, and the people they're attracting are truly unhinged. Here's another clip to show just how crazy it gets.
I do just want to point out one thing, that the president, everybody in Washington, whether they want to admit it or not, knows that this president is right when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to trade. In fact, Democrats have long said that the United States of America has been ripped off by the countries around the world. They just don't want to admit it now because it's President Trump who is saying that. In June...
No, these things are mutually exclusive. If you say the tariffs are non-negotiable, and not meant for negotiation, but then invite people to negotiate with you. That's contradictory. A non-negotiable thing can't be negotiated, and if you're inviting negotiations, it's clearly up for discussion. This is what I mean by the North Korea-style approach, where Carolyn Levitt is essentially saying, look, this thing is both a square and a circle. It's a circular square, folks. But some things simply can't be true at the same time. Certain things are mutually exclusive by definition. Yet, this is the kind of mental gymnastics that people like Carolyn Levitt, MAGA supporters, and Donald Trump have to perform to cover up Trump's incoherence and inconsistency. Here's another clip to demonstrate.
One being, can you explain the White House's evolution from this is not a negotiation on tariffs to countries should pitch us and start negotiations on
Sure.
tariffs?
As the president said yesterday, Jasmine, both things can be true at the same time. And it is a non-negotiable position that the United States has faced a national security and economic crisis because of the unfair trade practices by countries around the world. As for the president, I have maintained this position. The entire administration has always said that President Trump is willing to pick up the phone and talk. And the president met with his trade team this morning, and he directed them to have tailor-made trade deals with each and every country that calls up this administration to strike.
Once again, it doesn't really encourage countries to negotiate in good faith with Donald Trump because there's no delay or way to avoid the consequences. I just don't see how this approach will incentivize genuine negotiations. But we'll see. Now let's check out one last clip from Fox News reporter Jackie Heinrich.
Elena.
Hi, Caroline. It's clear the president has gotten the world's attention with these tariffs. Is he considering at all potentially holding off on imposing some of them before the deadline, or maybe later, reversing them because he's having these negotiations and having these good talks with other leaders?
The president was asked and answered this yesterday. He said he's not considering an extension or a delay. I spoke to him before this briefing. That was not his mindset. He expects that these tariffs are going to go into effect. And you said something very important, Elena, in your question. You said the president has captivated the attention of the world. Absolutely, he has. And it's about time we have a president in the Oval Office who is putting the world on notice and is putting the American people first, and again, is using the leverage of the United States to negotiate good trade deals.
Oil prices are falling globally because there's widespread concern about a potential recession. That's why oil prices are dropping, and why Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan have set recession odds at 60%. They're also noticing the decline in oil prices. But again, it's driven by fears of a recession. This isn't a good sign. But this is what I mean. It's like a full-blown North Korea or Soviet-style approach, where the press secretary for a dictator tells you that up is down, down is up, the sky is green, and somehow these two contradictory things can exist without breaking the space-time continuum. This is the kind of messaging we're seeing from the Trump White House. And remember, we're still less than 3 months in.